The following is an HDNet original presentation.
Tonight, meet the man who started it all, the father of outsourcing in India.
The initial proposition was, if you teach people how to do things, Indian workforce can do it better, cheaper, faster.
Silicon Valley high-techs are all over India now, hiring by the thousands. Washington and Wall Street say strong trade here is vital.
A country of 1 billion plus people growing at 9 to 10% cannot be ignored. If we ignore it, we do so at our peril in terms of our own economic prosperity.
But some policy experts warn that these are dangerous times for American workers.
You should be worried about the future of the American economy because our economy really depends on creating high-wage, high-tech jobs, and many of those are moving offshore.
We'll bring you the news tonight on Dan Rather Reports.
Good evening. Unemployment has become this nation's biggest paradox. The numbers say the economy's back in the black and corporate profits are at an all-time high. But millions of Americans are still out of work, and many of the good-paying jobs that built and sustained this country's middle class for decades are moving to faraway places, especially India. According to many in Washington and Wall Street, outsourcing is part of keeping American companies lean and competitive. There will be costs, they say, especially for displaced workers, but in the end, they say, India's success will be America's success. It's what they call a win-win for everyone. Others warn that we need to start thinking about just what it is we're trying to win. Because even though corporations are thriving in the global fight for jobs, America is losing big. And tonight you'll see ample evidence why all those jobs lost to outsourcing are not coming back.
For decades, Silicon Valley has been the beacon of the technological revolutions that have changed the world. From south of San Francisco through San Jose, this small swath of America has unleashed a never-ending quest to push beyond the boundaries of what was thought possible. This was the place where Google became a verb, where Facebook redefined friendship, where Intel invented the first microprocessor, where IBM and Hewlett-Packard invented personal computing and pioneered a new kind of company town. This valley has become America's pride and hope. But look a little closer, and you'll notice that the gleaming cities now feel more like glass ghost towns, the facade of a fading era. Nearly 75,000 people in Silicon Valley have lost their jobs during the Great Downturn. The layoffs were massive. Hewlett-Packard cut its payroll by 17,000. IBM reduced headcount by over 10,000. Cisco Systems laid off 6,000 people. Meanwhile, across the valley, there is a glut of empty office space that could fill more than 20 Empire State Buildings. And with unemployment here at nearly 11%, the local job center has never been busier.
There are many benefits of being a mature worker. You bring wisdom, you've handled adversity, you've handled diversity. It's all about how you present yourself.
But a lot of the job seekers here told us that while they've been through downturns before, this time it's different. You can see it on people's faces. John Burns says even with a master's degree, the prospects for finding any software engineering job are bleak.
I have been looking for 6 months, and I have 2 phone interviews that have been not gone forward, essentially.
Bu Nguyen says when his job as a test engineer at Cisco Systems got outsourced to Bangalore, India last January, he and his wife lost their health insurance and their home.
After I got laid off, and I have a lot of, high payment, like car payment, mortgage, so I can't afford the payment, in about 3 months I sold the house with a loss. So I had to move out, from the 3-bedroom house to, to share room, with my friends. After 28 years, working for Cisco, and I lost a job, and I lost almost everything.
One job, one person. Multiply that by tens of thousands, and that's what's going on across Silicon Valley. The cost-cutting frenzy helped the high-tech giants get their financial houses in order and reassure stockholders. Today, stock prices are up and profits are soaring. Corporate forecasts are promising a new era of growth, but among the workers in Silicon Valley, there is only a very strained and fragile sense of hope. Today, it is thousands of miles from home, here in India, where American companies are staking their hopes. It's like a never-ending job fair in India. Many companies rolling out big layoffs in the U.S. are doing business here, and they're hiring on a scale that would knock the wind out of job counselors in Silicon Valley. India's high-tech outsourcing industry hired 850,000 people last year alone. All across India today, there's an unmistakable sense of exuberance. The streets are filled with new enterprise, and people are bristling with new confidence and new jobs. Those new hires are not just staffing call centers. From software consulting to financial modeling, drug trials to electric engineering, India's giant pool of high-skilled labor is rapidly becoming the economic engine for American companies. And what makes that help so enticing is the cost. In India, the starting salary for a typical IT worker is less than $9,000 a year. For the first time, India has a real middle class that by some estimates is already bigger than the entire U.S. population. That middle class is going to shopping malls, out to restaurants, away on vacations.
All of you are going to lead a very large team.
Engineering colleges like this one in the coastal city of Chennai are graduating more than 350,000 people a year. That number doubled in just 5 years. This young, tech-savvy generation is forging a passage to a very different India. It is still a place where more than 600 million people live on less than $2 a day. But take another look inside the shanty towns and the defiant eyes, and you'll see people with new hope, the hope of a country on the rise. So how is it that the U.S. is getting a run for its money from a place that not so long ago was regarded as a desperate backwater? If there's one person who single-handedly changed the conventional wisdom about India, it's Raman Roy.
21, 22 years ago, nobody did international work out of India.
Based in an industrial hub on the outskirts of New Delhi, Raman Roy is the man hailed as the father of India's outsourcing industry. But back in the mid-1980s, he was just an accountant with a crazy idea. He wanted one of America's biggest multinational companies to set up an account processing center in a country where it was hard to find electricity, or paved roads, or clean water.
The initial proposition was if you teach people how to do things, Indian workforce can as well learn it and do it as their international counterparts, and they can do it better, cheaper, faster.
But he says the American executives were not so sure. It was inconceivable to them how a place with such abominable conditions could possibly be better cheaper or faster than the United States.
For 3 years, they won't listen. For 3 years, it came a thing that at international conferences, my superiors would turn around and say, "Oh God, that guy's come again. Please take him away because he'll just come and start talking about India." Because nobody was interested. As one of my seniors told me at that time, "What are you talking? You're talking of processing my vendor payable invoices from India? You know, I can't even talk to you for 3 minutes without the line dropping. Do I look stupid that I'll give you that work?" So we had to demonstrate to them that
even today, the famously unreliable power grid is so spotty that it went down in the middle of our visit.
each time it goes or comes back, that is where the state electricity comes in or our generators kick in.
It takes a litany of generators and a lot of invention in India just to keep the computers up and the workers humming.
So logistically, for an outsider, it may seem like a nightmare. We Indians don't stop in the middle of the sentence when electricity goes. It happens.
It was that Indian pride and grit which Roy says ultimately convinced American Express to let him set up the accounting center that rapidly became the envy of multinationals around the world. But Roy was just getting started. In 1996, he wanted to take outsourcing to the next level at General Electric. The first response that came down, Roy says, was call centers would never happen out of India.
Saying that you Indians can't do this. Said we'll show you, and we'll show you not only can we do it for ourselves, but we can do it for the world. And that is how this industry happened.
Everything is in place right now,
and boy, did it happen. What began in 1998 as a 500-seat experiment would grow into a multi-billion-dollar business with hundreds of thousands of employees. And call centers were just the beginning. In 1990, India's IT industry exports totaled $500,000. By 2000, that number had increased to nearly $6 billion. Today, India's IT exports is a $50 billion a year business. And nowhere are those fruits more manifest than here in the city of Bangalore. Under British rule, it was the capital of southern India. Now, rising above the cacophony of cars and motorbikes and listless cows, there are more and more plate glass towers. Today, Bangalore is called the Silicon Valley of India, and business is booming. In the past year, Dell Computers has doubled its headcount in India. Accenture Consulting, which had only a handful of employees here back in 2003, today has more than 50,000. American computer giant Hewlett-Packard is also estimated to have nearly 50,000 employees here. IBM, Big Blue, no longer discloses headcount by countries, but industry analysts estimate the company now employs more than 100,000 workers in India, more than in the U.S. Many U.S. companies, we found, were tight-lipped, secretive about their operations. Over and over, our interview requests were declined, and our camera crews turned away. The exception was Cisco Systems. The Silicon Valley-based company is the world's leading supplier of networks and routers. Half of all global internet traffic flows through the digital systems produced by Cisco. Showing us around Cisco's Globalization Center was Chief Innovation Officer V.C. Gopal Ratnam.
The campus was opened about 3 years ago, and it started out with this building behind us, but now we have about 4 buildings here.
Just 4 years ago, Cisco had only a couple of hundred people in India. Today, they have more than 6,000, and the company says there are thousands more on the way. Spend the afternoon here, and you get a glimpse into the vanguard of the new India, basking in the balmy afternoon, sipping smoothies, shaping up, polishing a new act with the company Glee Club. Jaya he Karnataka Mate, Jai Bharat Jananiya Tanujate. Cisco Systems says India has become a critical part of keeping its Silicon Valley operation competitive.
The time difference between the two locations is 12 hours, right? What really this allows you to do as a company, right, is to convert a 12-hour working day into a 24-hour working day. So essentially you double the throughput, and therefore you make faster decisions, your time to market is reduced, and you can actually respond to your customers better.
Cisco, which prides itself on being one of the few big high-tech players that still has the majority of its workforce in the U.S., is now doing nearly half its core research and development in India. That would have been unthinkable even 10 years ago. Example A is the campus itself. This is known as the smartest building in Cisco. What gives the building its smarts is a revolutionary network that allows all the subsystems to communicate with each other. The lights, the air conditioning, even the doors. That means when a worker arrives in the morning, the building is already 2 steps ahead.
When you go home Friday night, everything is powered down. And say you're the only person coming into the office on Saturday morning, and as you swipe your badge in and walk in, it recognizes that you're coming into your office. And therefore the lights from the garage downstairs all the way to your office are powered on. And essentially you will see the lights only for you to get to your office come out. Right?
Innovations like this, which will soon arrive in the U.S., were all designed from the ground up in India. And if you don't believe times are changing fast, listen to how Cisco's Chief Innovation Officer describes the current state of the U.S. job market.
I think it's the opportunity for the U.S. to kind of reinvent itself and really create high-end jobs in research and development and technology. There's plenty of work, and as we continue to innovate, I think we could use with all the help, wherever the help might be, whether it's in the U.S. or India or any other country.
It's not just Cisco. According to a survey by India's IT Industry Association, American companies operating in India have increased production 7-fold in the past 3 years. The bulk of those business operations involve research and development. Then there are the Indian outsourcing companies. They may have begun as small homegrown operations, but over the past decade, they've exploded into multinational giants. Some of the biggest players, which very rarely open their operations to American reporters, granted us access to their labs. HCL may not be a household name here in the U.S., but we rely on the company's handiwork all the time without knowing it. This radiation testing room looks like a film set from some old James Bond movie, but this lab is where electronics go to be tested and tortured before they're declared safe to sell in the U.S.
So this is a cold chamber. We are testing what we saw in this thermal shock for transition between
HCL specializes in R&D outsourcing, from solar panels to software for Boeing's new Dreamliner to in-flight entertainment systems.
The coolest part is the audio video on demand, like passenger selecting the movie what he wants. That is the very hard feature we have developed.
The company says they have the manpower and the experience to help their clients beat the competition. And of course, the price tag can't be beat. And we ain't seen nothing yet, according to Raman Roy.
So is there headroom to grow? There is a huge amount of headroom to grow. There is a huge amount of mutually beneficial opportunities that can be created.
Roy, the outsourcing innovator, spent the past decade in business for himself, reaping the rewards of an industry that's given the Indian nation of 1.2 billion people a new lot on life. He still shies away from the trappings of success, but he says his current company, called Quattro, is taking the outsourcing juggernaut to the next level.
Today, only the Fortune 1000 or maybe Fortune 1200 companies have by and large leveraged the gains of offshoring. We are saying that there is that capability that we can take to the mid-market.
Mid-market outsourcing is something sure to incite panic among American workers, because small and mid-market companies provide half of all private sector jobs in the U.S.
technical support, accounting, tax preparation. You could call a 1-800 number and say, I've got a virus in my PC, or you could go to a Quattro website and say, I need my tax return done. And yeah, we'll do it at a price that is, and at a quality that is vastly different from what you can get back home.
So let me know how I can assist you today.
He says Americans are very quick to complain about outsourcing, yet they demand the cost savings, especially when it comes to government spending and taxpayer dollars.
You tell me taxes do not have to be increased. Now we say, okay guys, we will not outsource. We'll bring them all back in, we'll create 150 more jobs, the bill will double, and now I'm going to raise your taxes. Because somebody's going to pay for the bill, no?
India rising. Now, when we return, the politics of outsourcing. Don't believe everything you see.
Scott Murphy says he has experience creating jobs, and he does, in India.
That's next.
Welcome back to the India of the 21st century. The rising middle class, the shiny new office parks, the engineering classes, the hiring sprees, shanty towns giving way to sparkling architectural masterpieces. But of course, India's growth looks a little different from the empty buildings of Silicon Valley. And across the United States, where a dismal job market has left no part of the country unscathed. So it's not surprising that in the recent midterm elections, with voter anger stoked by the bad economy, politicians from both parties made a pitch for votes by blasting outsourcing.
Scott Murphy says he has experience creating jobs, and he does, in India.
Schilling signed a pledge that protected tax breaks for companies who outsource. That's good for places like India and China. But what about us?
Even President Obama got into the act, blaming Republicans in a web address just weeks before the election.
When we recently closed one of the most egregious loopholes for companies creating jobs overseas, Republicans in Congress were almost unanimously opposed. The Republican leader, John Boehner, attacked us for it and stood up for outsourcing instead of American workers.
But then, what to make of this? After Democrats got thumped in the recent elections, the president's first trip from Washington raised some eyebrows. He was off to India. It was a trip that, at first glance, seemed to defy the campaign rhetoric. But the president had some clear goals in mind. For one thing, he wasn't alone.
International business is based on relationships.
Hundreds of business leaders were in India as part of a two-city, three-day summit timed to coincide with the presidential visit.
I believe that in our interconnected world, increased commerce between the United States and India can be and will be a win-win proposition for both nations.
America does infrastructure very well. We heard.
Co-hosting the India summit was a branch of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the same group that had spent so much money supporting Republican candidates in the last election cycle. If politics makes for strange bedfellows, U.S. trade policy leads to something downright bizarre.
If you take that model and try and apply that to India.
For decades, members of both parties, with the backing of big business, have advocated for open trade as an engine for economic growth.
Here's the idea. If the government helps U.S. companies gain access to overseas markets, those companies will increase sales and hire more American workers. That's the theory. Of course, trade negotiations are just that. And in the process, some American jobs will move to low-wage countries. But that's a price worth paying, according to the majority of lawmakers and economists, because trade deals, they say, reduce prices for American consumers, and eventually create new jobs for American workers.
The idea that India's buying American goods will lead to more American manufacturing and more American jobs had the president sounding a different tune in India about outsourcing than anything heard during the campaign.
There are many Americans whose only experience with trade and globalization has been a shuttered factory or a job that was shipped overseas. And there still exists a caricature of India as a land of call centers and back offices that cost American jobs. That's a real perception. But these old stereotypes, these old concerns, ignore today's reality.
President Obama's earlier anti-outsourcing rhetoric had gotten a lot of negative press in India, and many in the crowd were prepared to give him a chilly reception. But there was little in his speech that the India crowd couldn't cheer.
Trade between our countries is not just a one-way street of American jobs and companies moving to India. It is a dynamic, two-way relationship that is creating jobs, growth, and higher living standards in both our countries. And that is the truth.
The response was ecstatic. And just in case there were any questions about the administration's position on open trade, U.S. government officials were on hand to spread the message.
I think that government, first and foremost, plays a facilitator role.
Francisco Sanchez is the Undersecretary for International Trade at the Commerce Department. He's the administration's point person for selling the world on U.S. products.
My job is focused on getting American companies to export. If we do that right, if we get more American businesses exporting goods and services, we are going to see job growth in the United States.
Sanchez's job is to crisscross the globe, promoting the president's export initiative, which aims to double exports in 5 years. India, he says, is key to that goal.
A country of 1 billion plus people growing at 9 to 10% cannot be ignored. If we ignore it, we do so at our peril in terms of our own economic prosperity. The reality is that we live in a global marketplace and that emerging markets are growing much faster than our market. And so in order to continue to grow out of this recession that President Obama inherited, we have got to grow our export sector. And for many, many years, a lot of American business only looked inward. And President Obama's message is we can't just look inward anymore.
Looking inward will not give our economy the jolt it needs. But he said we can tap into India's economic growth, which is exploding.
We only have right now two-way trade of about $50 billion with India. To put that in context, we have over $80 billion with the country of the Netherlands, a country that's smaller than the city of New Delhi. And so the opportunities here to grow our exports and thereby create American jobs is vast.
For some business leaders at the summit, the payoff was immediate. Boeing got a multi-billion-dollar deal to sell military and civilian airplanes in India, which the White House helped broker. The administration also helped along a deal for General Electric to sell India jet engines and turbines.
We have 5,000 engineers and scientists based in Bangalore doing a lot of research on global projects, but also specifically for India, increasingly for India.
These deals were good news not just for American companies, but also for American workers, President Obama said.
Moments before I arrived here, several landmark deals were sealed between the United States and India. Boeing, one of America's largest companies, is on track to sell India dozens of commercial and cargo aircraft. General Electric, another American company, will sell more than 100 advanced jet engines. And today's deals will lead to more than 50,000 jobs in the United States. 50,000 jobs.
The conference was full of talk about trade deals, growing markets, and U.S.-India cooperation. But one phrase was almost completely absent: outsourcing. One person who's written the book on outsourcing says American business is setting a dangerous precedent. That part of the story And what he has to say is next.
When it comes to outsourcing, politicians love to talk the talk, especially during campaign season. But when it comes to actual policy making, nobody in Washington does much walking. There have been few pushes to stop outsourcing from either party, and there are several laws on the books that actually encourage it.
For example, consider the H-1B visa, or what many call the outsourcing visa. Every year, it allows U.S. companies to import tens of thousands of foreign guest workers. Those workers are often trained and then used to help move American jobs and our technological know-how overseas. And then there is this. Under current law, U.S. companies do not have to pay taxes on foreign earned profits, which means they save many millions of dollars by sending operations and jobs to places like India. The majority of lawmakers and economists say outsourcing is simply a part of free trade. And free trade is, they insist, a win-win for America. But there's a small but vocal group of experts who say it might be good for America's businesses, but that it's devastating America's workforce.
Why should the U.S. have a system where we have government policy that allows companies to undercut American workers? Makes no sense.
Ron Hero is a researcher with the Economic Policy Institute and a public policy professor at Rochester Institute of Technology. He wrote the book Outsourcing America, which argues that lawmakers need to stop providing incentives to companies that send jobs overseas.
So U.S. multinationals are able basically to get tax breaks for expanding their outsourcing. There's no other country in the world that actually encourages firms to expand overseas in lieu of expanding in the U.S. Through their tax policies. All the other countries, including, let's say, like India, which has been a big beneficiary, offer tax holidays for exports for bringing those jobs into the U.S. So that's kind of the crazy kind of system we've got.
Well, as a U.S. citizen, why should I be worried about this, if I should be worried?
Well, you should be worried. You should be worried about the future of the American economy, because our economy really depends on creating high-wage, high-tech jobs, and many of those are moving offshore.
Exactly how many Americans have had their jobs outsourced to India? Hira says nobody knows.
We don't really know how many jobs have been shipped overseas?
We don't know, and the reason we don't know is because the government has chosen not to collect the data.
Help the viewer understand what's going on here. When India seems to be booming, we have these high unemployment figures. What's really going on here?
Well, there's still demand. Americans are still buying products and services. The problem is that the labor demand that should generate is leaking overseas. It's pretty simple.
But what about the argument that what's good for the big corporations is in the end good for the U.S. economy and good for Americans as a whole?
I think this is another misconception. What's good for General Motors is good for America and vice versa. I don't think that's true anymore. We're losing a lot more jobs than we're gaining in that relationship.
If that's true, why do I keep hearing, listen, it's win-win for Americans, that the present policies are win-win. We win by getting to sell more products and open up markets overseas. It's just win all the way around.
Yeah, I think this is a slogan that's been carefully crafted. The folks who are benefiting have been able to shape the discussion and been able to say that this is a win-win, when in fact it's much more ambiguous, much more uncertain. We do know certain impacts are going to happen. The interesting part of it is that we've had this public discussion for more than 7 years. You could even go back 20 years. And there's been no policy response. Washington has chosen to do nothing.
To understand why outsourcing's ceased to be a matter of serious debate in Washington today, Hira says you have to rewind to 2003, when, he says, the debate was hijacked by a phenomenally successful, but he says highly misleading, series of reports by McKinsey Global Institute, the research arm of the giant McKinsey consulting firm.
The topic of offshoring is a very controversial topic right now, and much of that has to do with the fact that the people in the debate have lost perspective.
This web video from 2003 features Diana Farrell, McKinsey's lead author of the report called Offshoring, Is It a Win-Win?
We see the debate framed as a zero-sum game. Somebody's winning, somebody's losing, when indeed a more careful look at the facts would suggest that this really is a win-win game.
The report specifically looks at offshoring to India and found it reduced costs of nearly 50% due to lower wages, created new revenue from increased commerce with India, and redeployed workers who lost jobs from offshoring to new jobs. All in all, the report says, for every dollar spent, offshoring earns the U.S. between $1.12 and $1.14.
This is a win-win game because while a country like India, that is the recipient of a lot of this offshoring, wins, they're getting jobs, they're getting industry, they're getting income, the U.S. benefits even more.
But Professor Hira, for one, was not convinced because, he says, the 18-page document offered no hard data, but instead a lot of sweeping conclusions and questionable projections.
How has this research influenced the public debate about outsourcing?
Well, it's influenced it quite a bit. Diana Farrell, when she did the report, she actually did the rounds with all of the economic journalists. Steve Pearlstein from the Washington Post did an article. Steve Lohr from the New York Times, who's a reporter, quoted the numbers because McKinsey had numbers saying that the U.S. gained $1.12 for every dollar that got offshored. And that was reported like it was fact.
Hira says McKinsey's rosy projections were not accidental.
But there were two important things that weren't revealed. One was that McKinsey had strong conflicts of interest. They sold offshoring consulting services. So they were making millions of dollars advising companies on how to offshore. And secondly, NASSCOM, which is the Indian Outsourcing Trade Association, Industry Association, was a major client of McKinsey and probably had a lot to do with why the report was written.
And you pointed to several cases in which very respected journalistic enterprises and very respected reporters would depend on the McKinsey report figures for their own reporting. Let's examine for a moment the role of the press and the media in this.
From about 2003 to 2005, there was a lot more coverage about outsourcing. Today, you don't have much coverage, and one of the reasons is that the companies have been very careful about controlling what's going on. So, for example, IBM won't even disclose how many workers it has in India or in the U.S. anymore, something it used to disclose. So the corporate PR people have been very smart about how to control the message, to the point where even workers who are U.S. workers who are being forced to train their foreign replacements are threatened with lawsuits for speaking out. No one in Washington is representing American workers, particularly white-collar workers.
Well, as you spoke, I'm reminded that I interviewed some while ago the then CEO of Hewlett-Packard and some of his top assistants. They spoke of a possible future, said, look, if we don't get more help with such things as outsourcing and ability to bring in workers, guest workers from the outside, at some future time, we may just move the whole company headquarters out of California into someplace else.
Certainly the corporations can threaten these things. The question is, how do you make it attractive for them to stay in California? Well, is it by just lowering their taxes and giving them cheaper wages? Is that really a win, or is that a Pyrrhic victory for Americans?
When I question people, allegedly some of the smartest people about economics in the country, if not in the world, they say, well, Dan Rather, when you hear this kind of talk, recognize it for what it is. It's protectionist talk, and we know better than to deal in protectionism. To that you say what?
Well, I think this is a false choice that's being made, right? The argument is you want to be a free trader or a protectionist. What we should be talking about is not whether outsourcing is good or bad. It's both. It's both good and bad. There's both benefits and costs. There are winners and losers. The question is really, what policies do we take to actually shape outsourcing so that it actually works for Americans. We can argue that India has been protectionist in developing its IT industry by offering tax holidays. Basically, it's tax-free for any export. Is that free trade? Ronald Reagan, an open markets, free trade ideologue, put voluntary export restraints on autos coming from Japan. Was that free trade? I think that was smart policy. But what's different this time is that we don't have the U.S. CEOs on our side. That in fact, they're benefiting. They're not going into Washington and saying, look, I'm worried about my industry.
But if you were President Obama or some future Republican president, you say, well, I want to do something about it, but we can't afford to have Hewlett-Packard or companies of that size moving their whole headquarters overseas. What can they do?
Well, I think this is where leadership comes into play, and I think this is where there's no silver bullet. There's no single policy lever that one can use. But certainly presidents, policymakers can put leverage and use leverage on corporations to change behavior. But we've also got to change the incentive structure. So we've got to use carrots and sticks that make it profitable for those companies to hire Americans.
To those in India who represent the government of India or India corporations say, Dan, rather you picked the one professor, and you probably picked him because he is an American of Indian descent, that this is India bashing. India's done well. They've worked hard. They've had good policies, done well, and here you are putting a guy on television who's bashing India. Mm-hmm. What am I to say to those folks?
Oh, I'm an admirer of what India's done. I think they've been brilliant, and I'm very happy. I mean, I still have a lot of relatives, a lot of cousins, uncles, and aunts, many of whom are benefiting from this outsourcing boom, and it really has catalyzed the economy in a big way there. I'm not bashing India. I think they're working in their interests of their country and their companies and their workers. I'd like America to start acting that way.
But Hira says he is still skeptical. It's been 7 years since McKinsey's Win-Win report, and up until last month, the lead author, Diana Farrell, served as the deputy director of the National Economic Council, a critical advisor on the Obama administration's economic policy. And today, Hira says, the win-win proposition is cited as if it were an inevitable law of economics.
This is really a great win-win opportunity.
It is a win-win.
And win-win for both countries.
Increased commerce between the United States and India can be and will be a win-win proposition for both nations.
The American people are not happy about U.S. companies sending jobs overseas, especially in times like these. Outsourcing was cited by 86% of Americans polled by the Wall Street Journal and NBC News as the top reason for the country's jobless recovery. Over the past decade, Michigan has lost thousands of jobs to outsourcing.
Okay.
2 of those jobs were John McGrath's.
It's just tough. I'm not used to being in a position where I'm having to live from paycheck to paycheck.
A military man turned IT worker, McGrath says that Hewlett-Packard outsourced his entire team to Mexico in 2003. When he returned as a contractor for a second stint, he says he was assigned to a project for General Motors. And that project was actually helping GM outsource IT staff from its assembly plants.
They were targeting 200, possibly 300 layoffs, and that was accomplished at the end of the project.
That also meant McGrath was out of work once again.
I was laid off for over a year and a half before I finally landed a job here.
The company where McGrath landed looks pretty much like any small tech startup. They build and manage business software and applications. The workers speak code. The walls could stand some art, but systems in motion is by no means typical. Its founders were once executives in the outsourcing business with long careers of shipping American jobs overseas. But then they had a revolutionary idea. What if you could outcompete India from right here in Michigan? Systems in Motion's Chief Marketing Officer is Debashish Sinha.
If the choice now is between sending a job to Michigan versus sending a job to Bangalore, and you see that at the end of it, you basically save as much money, then wouldn't you rather be in Michigan than Bangalore?
Sinha started off in the outsourcing industry in his native India. He came to the United States in 1997, fell in love with the country, and decided to settle here permanently. He's now a U.S. citizen who believes that sending jobs overseas has gone too far.
This whole concept of anybody can work from anywhere, all you need is an internet connection, I think is absolutely wrong.
Colin Chapman is the general manager for Systems in Motion in Michigan. After handling offshore teams at Accenture Consulting and a big auto supplier, Chapman says he saw firsthand that offshoring was no cure-all.
This whole offshore playbook that has been developed was created and developed with a very specific type of work in mind, and it's a type of work that actually does lend itself to being able to be done across the ocean fairly well. And so all the work that was fairly easy to move offshore has now been moved offshore. Now we've got a whole set of work that people are saying, I saved a lot of money there, maybe I can apply it here. And it actually doesn't work everywhere.
The US has this tendency to think about itself as the innovation capital, if you will, and that the US should just do this high-level innovation, and all of the scale below it can be handled out of China and India. That doesn't really work very well unless you've actually spent a lot of time training people on what your business is and how it works and what makes you money and what is important to you.
Today, the company has over 100 employees, with more on the way.
Welcome on board. Awesome.
And some big-name clients, such as Best Buy and a toy company called Leapfrog. Within 5 years, they say, they're aiming to have more than 1,000 people on staff.
I mean, if you squeeze this, then you can actually get...
Of course, that's about what a big outsourcing company in India hires each week. And in this country, it was heavily subsidized by public dollars.
So the space is coming along?
It is coming along.
But Sinha says this is an investment that transcends business.
You have to build the next generation of American technology leadership if you want businesses to be sustainable. Because otherwise, 10 years from now, your chief information officer will have to come from India. Your chief technology officer will have to come from India. We will have absolutely no technology talent left in the US. And that is both a strategic blunder, not for the economy, but for the businesses themselves.
There are many who say outsourcing may be a juggernaut that's too big to stop. Whether it will end up being a win-win remains to be seen. But Washington shows few signs of changing course. And India's Information Technology Association is projecting that by 2020, the Indian outsourcing business will triple in size and employ more than 10 million people. And when it comes to the call centers that started it all, there's a whole new world out there. At least one report indicates that there are now more people manning the phone banks in the Philippines than in India. And that's our program for tonight. For HDNet, from New York, Dan Rather reporting. Good night.
If you'd like to add your name to an email list for information on upcoming programs, or if you would just like to send a question or comment, please email us at viewer@hd.net. Prospects for finding any software engineering job are bleak.
I have been looking for 6 months, and I have 2 phone interviews that have been not gone forward, essentially.
Bu Nguyen says when his job as a test engineer at Cisco Systems got outsourced to Bangalore, India last January, he and his wife lost their health insurance and their home.
After I got laid off, and I have a lot of, high payment, like car payment, mortgage, so I can afford the payment. In about 3 months, I sold the house with a loss. So I had to move out, from the 3-bedroom house to, to share room, with my friends. After 28 years, working for Cisco, and I lost a job, and I lost almost everything.
One job, one person. Multiply that by tens of thousands, and that's what's going on across Silicon Valley. The cost-cutting frenzy helped the high-tech giants get their financial houses in order and reassure stockholders. Today, stock prices are up and profits are soaring. Corporate forecasts are promising a new era of growth, but among the workers in Silicon Valley, there is only a very strained and fragile sense of hope. Today, it is thousands of miles from home. Here in India became a verb, where Facebook redefined friendship, where Intel invented the first microprocessor, where IBM and Hewlett-Packard invented personal computing and pioneered a new kind of company town. This valley has become America's pride and hope. But look a little closer, and you'll notice that the gleaming cities now feel more like glass ghost towns, the facade of a fading era. Nearly 75,000 people in Silicon Valley have lost their jobs during the great downturn. The layoffs were massive. Hewlett-Packard cut its payroll by 17,000. IBM reduced headcount by over 10,000. Cisco Systems laid off 6,000 people. Meanwhile, across the valley, there is a glut of empty office space that could fill more than 20 Empire State Buildings. And with unemployment here at nearly 11%, the local job center has never been busier.
There are many benefits of being a mature worker. You bring wisdom, you've handled adversity, you've handled diversity. It's all about how you present yourself.
But a lot of the job seekers here told us that while they've been through downturns before, this time it's different. You can see it on people's faces. John Burns says even with a master's degree,
The following is an HDNet original presentation.
Tonight, meet the man who started it all, the father of outsourcing in India.
The initial proposition was if you teach people how to do things, Indian workforce can do it better, cheaper, faster.
Silicon Valley high-techs are all over India now, hiring by the thousands. Washington and Wall Street say strong trade here is vital.
A country of 1 billion plus people growing at 9 to 10% cannot be ignored. If we ignore it, we do so at our peril in terms of our own economic prosperity.
But some policy experts warn that these are dangerous times for American workers.
You should be worried about the future of the American economy because our economy really depends on creating high-wage, high-tech jobs, and many of those are moving offshore.
We'll bring you the news tonight on Dan Rather Reports.
Good evening. Unemployment has become this nation's biggest paradox. The numbers say the economy's back in the black and corporate profits are at an all-time high. But millions of Americans are still out of work, And many of the good-paying jobs that built and sustained this country's middle class for decades are moving to faraway places, especially India. According to many in Washington and Wall Street, outsourcing is part of keeping American companies lean and competitive. There will be costs, they say, especially for displaced workers, but in the end, they say, India's success will be America's success. It's what they call a win-win for everyone. Others warn that we need to start thinking about just what it is we're trying to win, because even though corporations are thriving in the global fight for jobs, America is losing big. And tonight you'll see ample evidence why all those jobs lost to outsourcing are not coming back.
For decades, Silicon Valley has been the beacon of the technological revolutions that have changed the world. From south of San Francisco through San Jose, this small swath of America has unleashed a never-ending quest to push beyond the boundaries of what was thought possible. This was the place where Google, India, where American companies are staking their hopes. It's like a never-ending job fair in India. Many companies rolling out big layoffs in the U.S. are doing business here, and they're hiring on a scale that would knock the wind out of job counselors in Silicon Valley. India's high-tech outsourcing industry hired 850,000 people last year alone. All across India today, there's an unmistakable sense of exuberance. The streets are filled with new enterprise, and people are bristling with new confidence and new jobs. Those new hires are not just staffing call centers. From software consulting to financial modeling, drug trials to electric engineering, India's giant pool of high-skilled labor is rapidly becoming the economic engine for American companies. And what makes that help so enticing is the cost. In India, the starting salary for a typical IT worker is less than $9,000 a year. For the first time, India has a real middle class that by some estimates is already bigger than the entire U.S. population. That middle class is going to shopping malls, out to restaurants,